I come to the floor today to congratulate my colleagues on passage of the repeal and replacement of No Child Left Behind, the Every Child Succeeds Act. In particular, I want to thank Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray. It's really an example of how things can work here in the Senate when we put our mind to trying to get to good policy instead of simply trying to get to good politics. There's a lot of politics surrounding early childhood education and elementary education, a lot of hyperbole out there about the role the federal government should play in local education, issues like the Common Core, and yet we were able to set aside all of those potentially inflammatory and toxic politics and get to a bill that, despite those challenges, has broad consensus from Republicans and Democrats, and it ends up in a place that's really going to support a lot of teachers, students, parents, and administrators out there. And when you look at that vote tally, it's impressive. It's a piece of legislation that's been able to unite progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans. And in many ways, it's a credit in this chamber to the debate that Senator Alexander and Senator Murray set us upon. They were determined to get to a product that both parties could support. And when you start there, when you start with the idea that we can achieve a bipartisan solution rather than your starting point being having a debate in order to maximize political impact and political division, it's miraculous where we get. And listen, we're all, we can all be blamed for falling into that trap far too often. Mr. President, I think like you, my entire life has been spent in and around public education. I went to Connecticut's public schools. My mother grew up as a public school teacher. My wife is a former public school teacher. And of course, I have two beautiful boys, one of which is in the public school system as well. And so, you know, as it is for many of us, this conversation is deeply personal, but it's also deeply personal for me as someone who's going to raise two boys into a country whose greatness really now depends more than ever on the quality of our public schools. I mean, the reality is that when my great-grandfather got off of a boat and showed up in New Britain, Connecticut, he was pretty guaranteed to get a good job in one of the ball-bearing factories there, regardless of his education. He could get a good wage and a pension and a decent health care benefit without a lot of skills that he couldn't learn on the job inside that factory. And of course, our economy has radically changed since those days. We're lucky that we have declining unemployment. We're lucky that we continue to grow jobs as we have over the course of the last several years, but they're a totally different kind of job than were available to my forefathers, immigrants who came to this country from places like Ireland and Poland, worked in those factories. We now have jobs that require highly skilled professionals. We are competitive globally, not because of the price of our workforce, but because of the productivity and the competence and the educational level of our workforce. We are more dependent now than ever on the quality and the capacity of our workforce, which is, of course, dictated by the quality and the capacity of our educational system. And so getting education policy right is not just about serving kids, it's about serving our economy. But the fact is, we've been doing a disservice to students and teachers all across America since the passage of No Child Left Behind. This is a law that, by and large, was a disaster for us in Connecticut. And I'm somebody that believes that a strong federal government can play a beneficial role in people's lives, whether it be smoothing out the rough edges of the financial system, building roads and bridges, protecting America from attack. But the federal government has not done a good job in guaranteeing universal quality education. Why? Because bureaucrats in Washington ultimately have a hard time intersecting with the provision of a service which has largely been administered at a local level. And these prescriptive rules that were inherent in No Child Left Behind just haven't matched the realities of how in Connecticut we assess school and student performance, or how we think it's best to turn around schools. But No Child Left Behind did at least have one redeeming quality, and that was this. By requiring assessment of every single student, no matter where they lived, no matter their background, no matter their learning ability, the law did shed light on some unjustifiable, unconscionable disparities that existed in this country. And it put pressure on school districts and states to address those disparities. Disparities like the fact that the graduation rate for African Americans in this country is 16 points lower than that of their white peers. Results in disparities like those for Latino fourth graders, where only 25% of them are meeting expectations for grade level in math, which is half the rate of their white peers. Or when it comes to the practices within school districts, like school discipline. If you're an African-American boy and you commit the exact same offense in this country inside of a school, you're twice as likely to get suspended or expelled as your white peer. No Child Left Behind forced us to understand, recognize, and address those disparities. And so the challenge with this repeal and rewrite was to hand control back to states and to local districts without removing the imperative to identify those disparities and to cure them. I voted against the version of this bill which was originally passed by the United States Senate. And I did so because I labored under the belief as a member of the HELP Committee that it's not worth passing a national education law if it isn't also a civil rights law. And I just wasn't convinced that we had that balance right in the bill that initially came before the Senate. But I'm grateful to Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray, Representatives Klein and Scott and others who managed to get that balance right in the conference committee. And so today, we were able to pass a bill that is both a proper return of authority to the states while preserving civil rights protections that are going to guarantee the perpetuity of the small positive legacies of No Child Left Behind. So what we have in the bill is a recognition that schools should identify the 5%, school systems should identify the 5% of schools that are the lowest performing schools and have specific plans to attack those schools and to turn them around. But those interventions will be decided at the local and state level rather than decided at the federal level. In this bill, we have a requirement that we identify what we call dropout factories, schools in which a disproportionate number of students show up freshman year and don't graduate. And similarly, states have to have a plan to turn those schools around, dictated by decisions that are made at the local level. And lastly, this bill contains a provision that requires us to continue to track the performance of certain subsets of students, whether they be minority students, disabled students, poor students, or non-English speaking students. And it requires, again, for those vulnerable populations that may not be hitting the goals that are set by the state or school district, for there to be interventions to try to do better. All the accountability will occur locally, but the mandate that you do pay attention to those lower performing schools or to those populations that sometimes get the short end of the stick within a school system or a state educational system get special attention. I think it's the right balance. This is a bill that rightfully returns power to states and to school districts, but retains civil rights protections that have been the foundation of federal education policy since the 1950s and 60s. I'm also happy that there were a number of other important civil rights wins in this bill. States have to note on their report cards indicators of school climate and safety, and they have to disclose rates of suspension and expulsion, school-based arrests, and referral to law enforcement, so we can get a better handle on whether minority students are being treated fairly when it comes to school discipline policies. States have to submit plans for how they are going to reduce the use of discipline practices that threaten student safety, including seclusion and restraint. Increasingly, school districts are relying on the restraint of kids, binding hands and feet, or the seclusion of children, locking them into padded rooms as a means of discipline. In almost all cases, those means of discipline make the underlying behavior worse, not better. And they disproportionately affect disabled kids, children with autism, who school districts unfortunately don't understand as well as they should. This legislation requires states to submit plans as to how they're going to reduce the use of things like seclusion and restraint. And finally, this bill retains the requirement that every kid, regardless of their learning ability, be expected to meet the same standard. This bill still allows for 1% of students to take an alternate assessment, but it requires that the majority of special education students with learning disabilities, be tested against their non-disabled peers. They're going to have to compete against their non-disabled peers in the workforce, so they should be measured against their non-disabled peers while they're in the school system. Those are all important wins as well. But in the end, Mr. President, as someone who got educated in the public school system, someone who spent his lifetime around teachers, I know that No Child Left Behind not only sucked the effectiveness out of schools, but it also sucked the joy out of learning and out of teaching, because so much of it was driven towards this test, which became the only measurement of what a good school is. Now, I'm a parent who's deeply involved now in looking at schools and deciding which one's right for my kid. And while I pay attention to the test scores that come out of that school, that is not the beginning and the end of my analysis. I take careful pains to meet with the administrators, to talk to other parents, to look at their curriculum, to look at other measurements like attendance rates and graduation rates, to build a full picture of what a good school is. Now, states will be able to devise systems of measuring schools that mirror the way that almost every responsible parent measures schools as well, in a comprehensive, robust way that doesn't look just at that test. And Mr. President, maybe more importantly, as we try to grow a healthy economy that recognizes the strengths that we have, the quality of our workforce, under this new law, the Every Child Succeeds Act, we are going to be able to create a new generation that will be great innovators, great leaders, great mold breakers, not just great test takers. Congratulations to Senator Alexander, Senator Murray, to many others like Senator Booker and Senator Warren, who worked closely with me on the accountability provisions. This is a really important day for teachers and for students and for parents all across the country. It's also a pretty good day for us. We get to come together to do something really, really important in a bipartisan way. I yield back.